Sarah Martinez had always been a light sleeper. It came with the territory of being a school nurse, years of being on call for sick children, and worried parents had trained her ears to pick up the slightest disturbance. So when the scraping sound began at her front door on that October night, she was instantly awake. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 200 a.m. in harsh red numbers. Beside her, Mark slept peacefully, his breathing deep and rhythmic. He could sleep through a freight train, a trait she'd once envied but now found frustrating. The scraping continued, a deliberate, methodical sound like fingernails dragging across wood. It wasn't random or frantic like an animal might make. This was purposeful, controlled, almost ritualistic in its consistency. Sarah lay rigid in bed, every muscle tense as she listened. Her rational mind offered explanations: a tree branch blown by the wind, a cat sharpening its claws, maybe even a prank by neighborhood teenagers. But something about the sound felt wrong, felt deliberate in a way that made her skin crawl. The scraping had a rhythm to it. 3 long drags followed by a pause, then 3 more. Over and over, with mechanical precision, she waited for what came next in these situations: a knock. Chen from next door sometimes needed help in the middle of the night when her arthritis flared up badly. The elderly woman would knock softly, apologetically, 3 gentle taps that said she was sorry to bother them but really needed assistance. Other neighbors had done the same over the years. It was the unspoken rule of suburban politeness: you knocked before asking for help, even in emergencies. But no knock came. Just the scraping, continuing for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed seemed somehow louder than the noise had been, pressing against Sarah's eardrums with a weight that made her head aches. She waited another 10 minutes, straining to hear any other sounds: footsteps walking away, a car door closing, anything that would indicate whoever had been at her door was gone. When nothing came, she finally allowed herself to relax slightly, sinking back into her pillow. Maybe it really had been an animal after all. Maybe she was letting her imagination run wild because of the horror novel she'd been reading before bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every small sound: the house made, the refrigerator humming, the floorboards settling, the wind rustling leaves outside seemed amplified and threatening. Sarah found herself holding her breath, listening for the scraping to return. When dawn finally crept through the bedroom curtains, she felt exhausted and jittery, as if she'd spent the night running instead of lying in bed. Mark stirred as the alarm went off at 6:30, stretching and yawning before rolling over to kiss her good morning. "Sleep okay?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "Something woke me up around 2, Sarah said, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. There was a weird noise at the front door. "Like scratching or scraping?" "Probably just a raccoon," Mark said, already reaching for his phone to check his messages. "They've been getting into the Johnsons' garbage again. I saw the mess yesterday when I was getting the mail." Sarah nodded, wanting to believe it was that simple. "I'm going to check the door before I shower." She padded downstairs in her pajamas and slippers, morning light streaming through the kitchen windows and making everything look normal and safe. But when she opened the front door to examine it, her stomach dropped. Deep gouges marred the white-painted wood, 4 parallel lines that ran vertically from about shoulder height down to the middle of the door. The scratches had gone through the paint and into the wood beneath, leaving raw, splintered grooves that looked almost like claw marks. Mark. He appeared a few minutes later, hair still messy from sleep, wearing his old college t-shirt and pajama pants. His expression shifted from mild annoyance at being summoned to genuine concern when he saw the damage. "Jesus," he said, running his fingers along the gouges. "What the hell could have done this?" "I told you there was scratching," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around herself. "This is what I heard." Mark frowned, examining the marks more closely. "These are pretty deep. Must have been a big raccoon. Or maybe a dog. You know how German shepherds can get when they're anxious or scared. But why would a dog just stand here and scratch at our door?" "And for so long?" Sarah asked. It went on for at least 3 or 4 minutes. "Maybe it was hurt or lost and looking for help," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "We should ask around the neighborhood, see if anyone's missing a pet." They spent the morning calling their immediate neighbors, but no one reported a missing animal. Mrs. Chen hadn't heard anything unusual, which surprised Sarah since the elderly woman was almost as light a sleeper as she was. The Johnsons across the street were friendly, but hadn't noticed any stray animals in the area. The young couple next door on the other side had been out late at a concert and came home after 3, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. "We should file a police report," Sarah said as they ate lunch. "What if it wasn't an animal? What if someone was trying to break in?" Mark looked skeptical. "A burglar who scratches at doors instead of trying to pick locks or break windows. That doesn't make much sense, honey." "Neither does an animal doing this much damage and then just leaving," Sarah countered. "Look at those marks, Mark. They're perfectly parallel and they're deep. What kind of animal has claws that strong and that precise?" He sighed, recognizing the tone in her voice that meant she wasn't going to let this go. "Okay, we'll call the non-emergency line and report vandalism or something. But I really think you're overthinking this." The police officer who took their report over the phone was polite but clearly uninterested. "Property damage under $50. No witnesses, no suspects. It would be filed. But there wasn't much they could do unless it happened again." He suggested they install a security camera if they were concerned about repeat incidents. That afternoon, Mark drove to the hardware store and returned with a small can of white paint and a brush. He spent an hour carefully filling in the scratches and painting over them, making the door look almost normal again. Almost, but not quite. If you looked closely, you could still see the faint outlines of the gouges beneath the fresh paint. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "Good as new." Sarah wanted to feel reassured, but something nagged at her. As she helped Mark clean up the painting supplies, she found herself glancing repeatedly at the door, expecting to see the scratches reappear like wounds that wouldn't heal properly. That night, she lay in bed with every sense on high alert, listening for any sound that seemed out of place. Mark had fallen asleep easily, apparently unbothered by the previous night's incident. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened wasn't over, that the scratching had been just the beginning of something much worse. She was right. At exactly 2:00 a.m., the scraping sound returned. This time Sarah was ready for it. She slipped out of bed as quietly as possible, careful not to wake Mark, and crept to the bedroom window that faced the front yard. The porch light was on. Mark had insisted on leaving it on after the previous night's incident, and it cast a yellow circle of illumination over their front steps and door. At first, she didn't see anything. The porch appeared empty, just the welcome mat and the potted mums she'd put out for fall decoration. But the scraping sound was definitely coming from the front door, rhythmic and purposeful, just as it had been the night before. Sarah pressed her face closer to the window, straining to see what was causing the noise. Then she saw it, a shadow moving against the door, tall and angular, definitely human in shape, but somehow wrong in proportions. The figure was too thin, arms too long, movements too fluid and deliberate. It stood with its back to the yard, facing the door, its arms moving in slow, methodical motions against the wood. Even from the second-floor window, Sarah could hear the scraping, clearly fingernails or claws dragging across the surface with mechanical precision. Her first instinct was to call out, to demand to know what the person was doing. But something about the figure's posture and movements stopped her. There was something inhuman about the way it stood, perfectly still except for its arms, never shifting weight or adjusting position the way a normal person would. It was like watching a machine designed to mimic human behavior, but not quite getting it right. Sarah reached for her phone on the nightstand, moving slowly to avoid making any noise. She opened the camera app with shaking fingers, intending to record evidence of the intruder. But when she looked back at the window, the figure was gone. The porch stood empty under the yellow light, as if no one had ever been there. The scraping had stopped too. Sarah waited, phone in hand, for another 5 minutes, but nothing moved outside. Finally, she crept downstairs to check the door, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard throughout the house. Fresh scratches marked the door, deeper and more numerous than before. The new gouges had gone right through Mark's careful paint job, exposing the raw wood beneath. These marks were different from the first set, longer, more deliberate, arranged in a pattern that almost looked like letters or symbols. Sarah traced them with her finger, trying to make sense of the arrangement, but it was too dark to see clearly. She turned on the porch light and examined the door more carefully. The scratches definitely formed some kind of pattern, though she couldn't decipher what it might mean. They covered an area about 3 feet square, centered on the door, with the deepest gouges near the middle. Some of the marks were so deep that splinters of wood hung loose, as if whatever had made them had been digging rather than just scratching. "Sarah," Mark's voice called from upstairs. Everything okay? She had been gone longer than she'd intended. Just checking something, she called back. I'll be right up. When she returned to the bedroom, Mark was sitting up in bed, looking concerned. Did you hear something again? Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to tell him everything about the figure she'd seen, about the new scratches that were worse than before. But she could already predict his response. He'd want to check the door himself, and when he saw the damage, he'd assume it had happened while they were both asleep. He'd probably suggest they were dealing with a persistent animal that needed to be trapped or scared away. I thought I heard something, she said finally. But it might have been the wind. Mark accepted this explanation and went back to sleep within minutes. But Sarah lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. Someone or something was deliberately targeting their house, coming back night after night to leave increasingly elaborate messages on their door. But why? And what did the scratches mean? The next morning, she photographed the new damage before Mark could see it. The pattern was even more complex in daylight, with dozens of intersecting lines that created an almost hieroglyphic appearance. She spent her lunch break at work researching symbols and markings online, but nothing she found matched what she'd photographed. Rough night? Asked Linda, one of her fellow nurses, noticing the dark circles under Sarah's eyes. Just some noise that kept me awake, Sarah said, not wanting to go into details. Probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and it was getting worse. Mark discovered the new scratches when he got home from work that evening. His reaction was exactly what Sarah had expected, frustration mixed with determination to solve the problem practically. That's it, he said, examining the damaged door. We're getting a security camera. I want to see exactly what's doing this. He ordered a wireless camera system online that evening, paying extra for overnight shipping. The cameras would arrive the next day and could be installed immediately. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the prospect of having video evidence of their nocturnal visitor. Part of her wanted proof that she wasn't losing her mind, but another part wondered if she really wanted to see whatever was responsible for the increasingly violent scratches. The third night, Sarah made sure to be in position by the window well before 2:00 a.m. She had her phone ready to record, though she wasn't sure video taken through the bedroom window in the dark would show much detail. Mark slept soundly beside her, apparently able to block out both the scratching sounds and Sarah's restless movements. At 2:00 a.m. exactly, the scraping began again. This time, Sarah was watching when the figure appeared. It didn't walk onto the porch or approach from the yard, it simply materialized in front of the door, as if it had been there all along and had suddenly become visible. The sight made Sarah's blood run cold. Whatever was out there, it wasn't entirely human. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its movements were fluid but wrong, like watching someone move underwater. It wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb the porch light rather than reflect it, before making it difficult to see clearly. But the most disturbing thing was its head. It was too large and oddly shaped, and it never turned away from the door even slightly. Sarah raised her phone to record, but the moment she did, the figure stopped moving. It stood perfectly still for several seconds, then slowly turned its head to look directly at Sarah's window. Even from the second floor and in the dim light, she could feel its gaze on her, intense and knowing. It knew she was watching. The figure raised one arm and pointed directly at her window. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, a clear acknowledgement that it knew she was there. Then it turned back to the door and resumed its scratching, but faster now, more aggressive. The sound changed from methodical scraping to frantic clawing, as if it was trying to tear through the wood entirely. Sarah fumbled with her phone, trying to start the video recording, but her hands were shaking so badly she kept hitting the wrong buttons. By the time she managed to begin recording, the figure was already fading, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving only the quiet sounds of the night. She played back the video she'd managed to capture, but it showed only an empty porch under the yellow light. There was no sign of the figure, no evidence of the violent scratching she'd just witnessed. The audio was equally useless, no scraping sounds, just the ambient noise of wind and distant traffic. This time, Sarah went downstairs immediately to check the door. The damage was extensive, deep gouges covered nearly the entire surface, as if something with razor-sharp claws had tried to shred the wood completely. Some of the scratches went so deep they'd gone completely through the door in places, leaving small holes that let in the cold night air. But most disturbing were the new marks near the top of the door scratches that formed clear letters spelling out a single word: Sown. Sarah stared at the message, her mind reeling. This wasn't random vandalism or animal damage. Something intelligent was targeting their house, leaving increasingly threatening messages. And it knew she was watching. She didn't tell Mark about the message. Instead, she used a marker to color in the letters, making them look like random scratches among all the other damage. When he saw the door the next morning, he was angry but focused on practical solutions. "The cameras will be here this afternoon," he said grimly. "Whatever's doing this will catch it on video, and then we'll know how to deal with it." Sarah nodded, though she suspected the cameras wouldn't capture anything useful. Whatever was visiting their house seemed to exist at the edge of perception, visible only when it chose to be seen. But she didn't voice these concerns to Mark. He was already worried enough, and she didn't want him to think she was having some kind of breakdown. The security cameras arrived as promised, and Mark spent the evening installing them. He mounted one camera above the front door to capture anyone approaching the porch, and another in the front yard aimed at the door from a different angle. The system would record continuously and send alerts to both their phones when motion was detected. "There," Mark said, testing the app on his phone. "Now we'll see what's been causing all this damage." That night, Sarah lay in bed with her phone in her hand, the security app open and ready. She'd set the motion sensitivity to maximum, hoping to catch even the slightest movement near their front door. Mark had taken a sleeping pill, claiming he needed a good night's rest after several days of interrupted sleep. Sarah envied his ability to disconnect from the situation, but she couldn't relax her vigilance. At 1:58 a.m., her phone buzzed with a motion alert. Sarah opened the app immediately, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. The camera feed showed their front porch in crisp black and white, the door clearly visible in the center of the frame. The porch was empty. But even as Sarah watched, she could hear the scraping beginning again, louder and more violent than ever before. The sound seemed to come from right outside their bedroom window, as if whatever was making it was standing directly below. Yet the camera showed nothing, just an empty porch and a door that remained undamaged. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as new scratches began appearing on the door in real time. Deep gouges materialized across the wood as if carved by invisible claws, the marks appearing spontaneously without any visible cause. The scratching sound grew louder and more frantic, but the camera showed only an empty porch with a door that was somehow destroying itself. She shook Mark awake, thrusting the phone toward him. "Look at this," she whispered urgently. "The cameras aren't picking up anything, but look at the door." Mark squinted at the screen, still groggy from the sleeping pill. "I don't see anything," he mumbled. "It just looks like our front porch." "The scratches," Sarah said, pointing at the screen. "Can't you see them appearing? And listen, can't you hear the scraping?" Mark was quiet for a moment, seeming to focus on the sounds around them. Then he shook his head. "No, Sarah, I don't hear anything." The scratching stopped abruptly, as if in response to Mark's words. Sarah stared at her husband in disbelief. "You really can't hear it?" "Hear what?" Mark asked gently. "Honey, I think you might be more stressed about this whole situation than you realize. Maybe you should make an appointment with Dr. Peterson just to talk things through." Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that he must have heard something. But the look on Mark's face stopped her. It was the expression he wore when he was worried about her mental health. The same look he'd had during her difficult period after her father's death 2 years ago. She realized that pushing the issue would only make him more concerned. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "I'll call tomorrow." But privately, Sarah knew she wasn't imagining things. The scratches on the door were real. Even if the cameras couldn't capture whatever was making them, and if Mark couldn't hear the sounds anymore, that was just another disturbing development in an already terrifying situation. Over the following days, Sarah began to notice other changes. Neighbors who had previously expressed concern about the strange sounds coming from her house now seemed to have no memory of their earlier conversations. Mrs. Chen, who had mentioned hearing odd noises just a week before, now looked at Sarah with polite confusion when asked about it. "I'm sorry, dear, but I don't know what you mean," the elderly woman said when Sarah approached her while getting the mail. "I haven't heard any unusual sounds. Are you feeling all right?" The Johnsons across the street had a similar response when Sarah tried to discuss the situation with them. They remembered her asking about missing pets, but couldn't recall expressing any concern about nighttime disturbances. Even the mail carrier, who had commented on the door's damaged appearance just days before, now seemed to see nothing wrong with it. "Your door looks fine to me," he said cheerfully, handing Sarah a package. "Lovely color. Did you just have it painted?" Sarah looked at the door in bewilderment. To her eyes, it was covered in deep scratches and gouges, some forming clear letters and symbols. But everyone else seemed to see a pristine white door with no damage at all. She began to wonder if she really was losing her mind. The visits continued nightly, always at exactly 200 a.m. Sarah would lie in bed listening to the increasingly violent scratching, watching through the security app as new damage appeared on a door that only she could see as damaged. The messages carved into the wood became more frequent and more threatening. "Son" was followed by "SOMG," and then "RDA." Mark slept through every incident, claiming he never heard anything unusual. When Sarah showed him the security footage the next day, all he saw was an empty porch with a normal-looking door. The app showed motion alerts at 2:00 a.m. every night, but the video never captured anything that would explain the alerts. "Maybe there's something wrong with the cameras," Mark suggested. "Or maybe the motion detection is too sensitive and it's picking up insects or shadows." Sarah made an appointment with Dr. Peterson, her family physician, hoping for some kind of medical explanation for what she was experiencing. Maybe she had developed a sleep disorder that was causing hallucinations, or perhaps stress really was affecting her perception of reality. Dr. Peterson was thorough and compassionate, ordering blood tests to check for everything from vitamin deficiencies to neurological issues. The results came back normal. Her hearing test was perfect. Her mental status exam showed no signs of cognitive decline or psychiatric illness, and her stress levels, while elevated, were within normal ranges for someone dealing with sleep disturbance. "I think you're experiencing a form of hypnagogic hallucination," Dr. Peterson explained. "It's surprisingly common, especially during periods of stress or sleep deprivation. The brain can create very vivid auditory and even visual experiences during the transition between sleep and wakefulness." Sarah wanted to believe this explanation, but it didn't account for the physical evidence, the scratches on the door that she could touch and photograph, even if no one else could see them. She didn't mention this to Dr. Peterson, knowing it would only lead to referrals to psychiatrists and medications she didn't want to take. Instead, she nodded and accepted a prescription for a mild sleep aid, promising to call if the symptoms persisted or worsened. But she had no intention of taking medication that might make her sleep through the nightly visits. Whatever was happening, she was the only witness to it, and she needed to stay alert. 3 weeks after the incidents began, the pattern changed. Sarah had grown accustomed to the 2:00 a.m. scratching, had even begun to find it almost routine despite her fear. But on this night, the motion alert came at 1:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. Sarah opened the security app and saw the familiar empty porch, but something felt different. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive, and the quality of the light looked wrong somehow. As she watched, a figure began to materialize in front of the door, not walking into frame from the sides, but simply becoming visible as if stepping through an invisible barrier. But this time, it wasn't the tall, thin figure she'd seen before. This was clearly human, wearing familiar pajamas and slippers. With growing horror, Sarah realized she was looking at herself on the security camera. The figure on the screen was an exact duplicate, standing at the front door with raised hands, fingers curled into claws. Sarah looked down at her own hands, which were resting on the phone screen. Then she looked back at the camera feed, where her doppelganger was methodically scratching at the door. The scratching sounds she'd been hearing weren't coming from outside the house, they were coming from the phone's speaker, transmitted by the security camera. But that was impossible. She was in bed, watching the feed. She wasn't outside, and she certainly wasn't the one making the scratches. Yet the evidence was right there on the screen, her own body, her own movements, carving fresh damage into the door she'd been watching for weeks. Sarah tried to wake Mark, but found that she couldn't speak. Her voice seemed to have disappeared entirely, leaving her able to breathe but unable to make any sound. She tried to shake him, but her arms wouldn't respond to her commands. She could only lie there, paralyzed, watching herself destroy her own front door. The figure on the screen, her figure worked for exactly 3 minutes, just as the mysterious visitor had done every night. Then it stopped. turned to look directly at the camera, and smiled. It was Sarah's face, Sarah's smile, but the expression was wrong, twisted into something that didn't belong on human features. The figure waved at the camera, a cheerful gesture that made Sarah's blood run cold. Then it walked out of frame, disappearing to the left side of the porch. A moment later, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom. Soft, familiar footsteps in slippers that matched the ones on her own feet. The bedroom door opened slowly, and Sarah saw herself standing in the doorway. The other Sarah looked exactly as she should: rumpled pajamas, messy hair, concerned expression. But there was something in its eyes that didn't belong, an intelligence that felt foreign and hostile. "Mark," the other Sarah said in a perfect imitation of her voice. "I heard something outside." Mark stirred but didn't wake fully. "MMK?" he mumbled. "Be careful." The other Sarah smiled that wrong smile again, then turned and walked back down the hallway. Sarah tried desperately to move, to call out, to warn Mark somehow, but her body remained completely unresponsive. She could only watch and listen as her duplicate moved through their house. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the other Sarah returned. It climbed into bed next to Mark, settling into the exact position Sarah had been in before the paralysis began. As soon as it was in place, Sarah felt control returning to her body, sensation flooding back into her limbs. But when she looked around, she was no longer in her bedroom. She was standing on the front porch in her pajamas and slippers, the cold October air cutting through the thin fabric. Her hands were raised toward the door, fingernails split and bleeding from scratching at the wood. Fresh gouges covered the surface, deeper and more extensive than ever before. Sarah stumbled backward, staring at her damaged fingernails and the ruined door. She could see the scratches clearly, could feel the splinters embedded under her nails, could smell the fresh scent of torn wood. But when she looked through the front window into the living room, she could see herself sleeping peacefully in bed upstairs, visible through the open bedroom door, two Sarahs, one asleep in bed next to Mark, one standing on the porch with bloody fingernails and the memory of watching herself commit acts of vandalism she didn't remember performing. Which one was real? Sarah tried the front door, but it was locked. She didn't have her keys, and even if she did, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back inside with the thing that was wearing her face and sleeping next to her husband. Instead, she sat on the porch steps and waited for dawn, trying to make sense of what had happened. As the sun rose, Sarah felt a strange tugging sensation, as if something was pulling her back toward the house. She resisted at first, but the feeling grew stronger and more insistent. Finally, she gave in and walked to the front door. This time it opened at her touch. She climbed the stairs quietly and looked into her bedroom. Mark was still asleep, and there was no sign of the other Sarah. The bed looked as if only one person had been sleeping in it, with just Mark's side disturbed. Sarah's side was neat and undisturbed, as if she had never been there at all. Confused and exhausted, Sarah climbed into bed. The moment her head hit the pillow, memories flooded back, memories of the entire night spent sleeping peacefully, of waking briefly when Mark mumbled something about checking the door, of drifting back to sleep without giving it much thought. But she also retained the memories of standing paralyzed in bed, watching her doppelganger, finding herself on the porch with bloody fingernails. Two sets of memories for the same time period, both feeling equally real and authentic. When Mark woke at his usual time, he kissed her good morning as if nothing had happened. "Sleep better?" he asked. "You seemed more settled last night?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She excused herself to shower and examined her hands carefully. Her fingernails were perfect, no splits, no blood, no embedded splinters. Yet she could swear she remembered the pain of scratching at the door, could still feel the phantom ache in her nail beds. She checked the front door before Mark could see it. The damage was worse than ever, covering the entire surface with deep clear messages, "Somans, N-O-M-N-G and Y and now," carved in letters 6 inches high, tone HT. But when Mark came downstairs for breakfast, he complimented her on how nice the front door looked, commenting that the white paint was holding up well despite the autumn weather. Sarah realized she was completely alone in this experience. Not only could no one else see or hear what was happening, but she was somehow being made to participate in it against her will. The thing that visited their house every night wasn't trying to get in, it was already inside, wearing her face and using her body to prepare for something that would happen tonight. She spent the day in a state of barely controlled panic, jumping at every sound and checking the front door obsessively. The scratches were always there when she looked, fresh and deep and threatening. But everyone else, Mark, the neighbors, delivery people, saw only a normal door in good condition. Sarah considered leaving, packing a bag and checking into a hotel until she could figure out what was happening. But she couldn't abandon Mark to face whatever was coming alone, especially when he couldn't even perceive the threat. And deep down, she suspected that running wouldn't help. Whatever was happening to her would follow wherever she went. As evening approached, Sarah made preparations. She set up her phone to record continuously, not through the security app but using the regular camera function. She positioned it to capture both the bed and the bedroom door, hoping to document whatever was about to happen. She also left notes for Mark, explaining everything she'd experienced, hidden in places he would find them if something happened to her. At 11:30 p.m., she took a shower and put on fresh pajamas, feeling oddly like she was preparing for a performance. The sense of anticipation was overwhelming, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for midnight to arrive. Mark fell asleep easily, helped by another sleeping pill. Sarah lay beside him, wide awake and hyper-alert, watching the clock and waiting for 200 a.m. But she had a feeling that tonight would be different, that the usual routine was about to change dramatically. She was right. At exactly midnight, Sarah felt the familiar paralysis begin to take hold. But this time, instead of losing control of her body while remaining mentally aware, she felt her consciousness being pushed aside, compressed into a small corner of her mind while something else took control. She watched from inside her own head as her body sat up in bed, moving with fluid grace that didn't feel like her own. Her hands reached for the phone and turned off the recording app, then deleted the video file she'd already captured. The thing controlling her body knew about her preparations and was systematically undoing them. Next, it found the notes she'd hidden for Mark and destroyed them, tearing the papers into small pieces and flushing them down the bathroom toilet. It moved through the house with purpose and intelligence, erasing all evidence of Sarah's attempts to document what was happening. Finally, it returned to the bedroom and positioned her body at the window, looking down at the front porch. Sarah could see through her own eyes, but she had no control over where she looked or how she moved. She was a passenger in her own body, forced to watch as the thing that had taken control prepared for whatever was about to happen. At 2:00 a.m., figures began materializing on the front porch. Not just one this time, but dozens of them appearing in the yellow circle of light cast by the porch lamp. They were all tall and impossibly thin, wearing dark clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their movements were fluid and wrong, like watching people move underwater. But the most disturbing thing was their faces. Sarah could see them clearly from the second-floor window, and every single figure had her face. Dozens of figures poured through the doorway, all wearing Sarah's face, all moving with that horrible fluid grace. They filled the bedroom in seconds, surrounding the bed where Mark sat frozen in terror. His eyes darted between the intruders and Sarah, confusion and fear warring in his expression. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What's happening? Who are they?" Sarah tried to answer, but found that her voice had disappeared again. She could only watch in horror as the figures closed in on Mark, their movements perfectly coordinated. They reached for him with hands that looked exactly like hers, fingers that bore no trace of the blood and splinters she remembered from her night on the porch. Mark screamed as they touched him, a sound of pure terror that cut through Sarah like a knife. But the scream was cut short, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. The figures had done something to him, something that left him conscious but unable to make any sound. They lifted Mark from the bed with gentle care, as if he were made of fragile glass. His eyes were wide with panic, darting between the dozens of Sarah faces surrounding him. He mouthed words, her name, pleas for help, questions she couldn't answer but no sound came out. The figures began to move toward the doorway, carrying Mark between them like pallbearers. Sarah tried to follow, to intervene somehow, but found that her feet wouldn't obey her commands. She was frozen in place, forced to watch as they took her husband away. "Don't fight it," said the figure nearest to her, speaking in Sarah's own voice. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To understand what was happening, to see the truth." "I don't understand," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice returning suddenly. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" The figure smiled that wrong smile. We're not doing anything to you, Sarah. We are you. All of us, every possibility, every path not taken, every choice you didn't make. We've been waiting so long to come home." That's impossible, Sarah said. But even as she spoke, she could see similarities in each figure that went beyond their identical faces. The way one held its left shoulder slightly higher, exactly like Sarah did when she was nervous. The unconscious habit another had of touching its wedding ring, a gesture Sarah made dozens of times each day. These weren't just copies of her appearance, they were copies of her mannerisms, her personality, her very essence. "Is it?" the figure asked. "Haven't you felt us watching? Haven't you sensed that there were other versions of yourself, living other lives, making other choices? We've been trying to visit for so long, but the barriers between worlds are so strong. Until recently." "What changed?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "You did," the figure said gently. "Your grief over your father's death, your growing dissatisfaction with your life, your sense that you'd made wrong choices, all of that weakened the boundaries. You called to us without realizing it, and we finally found a way to answer." Sarah remembered the difficult period after her father's death, the months of depression and anxiety that had nearly destroyed her marriage. She'd spent countless hours wondering about the paths not taken, the decisions that had led her to this life instead of some other, possibly better one. Had those thoughts really been enough to tear holes between dimensions? "We don't want to hurt anyone," the figure continued. "We just want to live, to experience the life you've built here, the husband you chose, the home you've made. We've been alone for so long, existing in the spaces between possibilities. Don't you understand how wonderful it is to finally have substance, to finally be real?" The procession carrying Mark had disappeared through the doorway, but Sarah could hear their footsteps on the stairs moving slowly and carefully. They were taking him somewhere, but where? And why? "Where are you taking him?" Sarah demanded. "Somewhere safe," the figure assured her. "Mark is precious to us because he's precious to you. All of your memories, all of your love for him, we share those feelings. We would never harm something so important. But you're taking him away from me." The figure's expression grew sad, almost pitying. "Oh, Sarah, you still don't understand. We're not taking him away from you. We're taking him away from this version of you, the one who was never supposed to exist in the first place." "What do you mean?" "Look around," the figure said, gesturing to the bedroom. "Look at this life you've built, the job you don't really enjoy, the house that's too small, the dreams you abandoned. Is this really the life you wanted? Or is it just the one you settled for?" Sarah looked around the bedroom she'd shared with Mark for 8 years, the furniture they'd bought secondhand when they couldn't afford anything better. The water stain on the ceiling from the leak they'd never quite fixed properly. The stack of bills on the dresser that they struggled to pay each month. It wasn't a bad life, but it wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself when she was younger. "Everyone settles," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Do they?" the figure asked. "Or do they just tell themselves that to make the disappointment easier to bear? We know better, Sarah. We've seen the lives you could have lived. The Sarah who became a doctor instead of a nurse. The Sarah who traveled the world instead of staying in the same small town. The Sarah who married her college boyfriend instead of Mark, who had children instead of remaining childless, who wrote novels instead of filing insurance forms." Each alternative life the figure described hit Sarah like a physical blow. These were thoughts she'd had in her darkest moments, regrets she'd tried to suppress and forget. How could this thing know about dreams she'd never shared with anyone? "Because we lived those lives," the figure said, apparently reading her thoughts. "Every choice creates branches, Sarah. Every decision splits reality into multiple paths. You chose this life, but we lived all the others. And now we want to turn at this one." The house had grown quiet. The sounds of footsteps and movement from downstairs had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence that seemed to press against Sarah's consciousness. She realized that she was now alone with this creature that wore her face and claimed to be her alternative selves. "You can't just take over my life," Sarah said, trying to inject strength into her voice. "This is my reality, my choice. You don't belong here." The figure laughed, a sound that was definitely Sarah's laugh, but somehow hollow and wrong. "Don't we? You called us here, Sarah. Your dissatisfaction, your regrets, your constant wondering about what might have been, that was an invitation we couldn't ignore. And now that we're here, now that we've tasted what it's like to be real instead of just possibilities, do you really think we'll go back to existing in the spaces between choices?" "I'll fight you?" Sarah said, though she wasn't sure how to fight beings that seemed to be made of her own regrets and unfulfilled desires. "With what?" the figure asked gently. We know everything, feel everything you feel. We are you, Sarah, just as much as you are us. The only difference is that we've accepted what you refuse to acknowledge, that this life isn't enough. The figure moved closer, and Sarah could see herself reflected in its eyes, not just her physical appearance, but something deeper. Her fears, her disappointments, her secret conviction that she'd wasted her potential on safe choices and comfortable compromises. "Let us help you," the figure said, reaching out with Sarah's own hand. "Let us show you what life could be like, without the weight of regret, without the constant wondering about paths not taken. We can live this life better than you ever did. Rest." Sarah backed away from the reaching hand. "You mean die? We mean peace?" the figure corrected. "No more lying awake at night wondering if you made the right choices. No more looking at other women your age and wondering if their lives are more fulfilling than yours. No more going through the motions of a life you're not sure you really wanted." The offer was tempting in a way that terrified Sarah. She had spent so many nights lying awake thinking exactly those thoughts, questioning every major decision she'd ever made. The idea of simply letting go, of allowing these other versions of herself to take over the burden of living, had an appeal she didn't want to acknowledge. But then she thought of Mark, carried away by creatures wearing her face, probably terrified and confused and wondering why his wife wasn't helping him. Whatever regrets she had about her life, whatever disappointments and compromises she'd endured, Mark didn't deserve to suffer for them. "What did you do with my husband?" she asked. "He's safe," the figure repeated. "We'll put him somewhere he can't interfere while we complete the transition. Once you accept what needs to happen, once you let us take over properly, he'll never know the difference. We'll love him exactly as you do, care for him exactly as you do. He'll be happier with us than he ever was with you." "That's not true," Sarah said, but doubt crept into her voice. Had she been a good wife to Mark? Had she given him the love and attention he deserved, or had she been too caught up in her own dissatisfaction to fully appreciate what she had? "Isn't it?" the figure asked. "When was the last time you really looked at him, Sarah? When was the last time you felt grateful for his love instead of taking it for granted? When was the last time you made love to him without your mind wandering to thoughts of what your life might have been like with someone else?" Each question hit home with devastating accuracy. Sarah realized that this creature didn't just look like her, it knew her intimately, understood her secret thoughts, and hidden shames better than she understood them herself. "Everyone has doubts," Sarah said weakly. "But not everyone lets those doubts consume them," the figure replied. "Not everyone spends years building walls around their heart, protecting themselves from the very love they claim to want. Mark deserves better than a wife who sees him as a reminder of her own compromises." Sarah wanted to deny this, wanted to insist that she loved Mark completely and without reservation. But the words wouldn't come, because part of her recognized the truth in what the figure was saying. She had let her regrets poison her present, had allowed her disappointment with her own choices to create distance between herself and the man who loved her. "But I can change," Sarah said desperately. "I can be better, love him better. You don't have to take over my life to fix what's wrong with it." The figure's expression grew gentle, almost maternal. "Oh, Sarah, you've been telling yourself that for years. How many times have you promised to be more present, more grateful, more loving? How many resolutions have you made and broken? How many chances have you already had?" Too many, Sarah realized. She'd been having these same conversations with herself for years, promising to appreciate what she had instead of mourning what she'd lost. But the promises never lasted long before the old patterns reasserted themselves. "It's not your fault," the figure continued. "You were never meant to live this particular life. The Sarah who belonged here, who could have been truly happy with these choices, she was overwritten when you made different decisions. You've been trying to live someone else's life, and that's why it never felt quite right." "Then why did I make those choices?" Sarah asked. "If this isn't the right life for me, because choice isn't as free as people pretend it is," the figure said. "Fear, obligation, other people's expectations, they all influence the decisions we make. The Sarah who married Mark did so because she was afraid of being alone, not because he was her true love. The Sarah who became a nurse did so because it was practical and safe, not because healing was her passion. Every major choice you made came from fear rather than desire." Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she recognized the truth in these words. She had married Mark because he was kind and stable and wanted to take care of her, not because she felt any great passion for him. She had chosen nursing because it guaranteed steady employment and decent benefits, not because she felt called to the profession. Even their house had been chosen based on what they could afford rather than what they actually wanted. "We can fix all of that," the figure said softly. "We can live this life the way it was meant to be lived, with gratitude instead of resentment, with love instead of obligation. Mark will be happier, you'll be at peace, and we'll finally have the chance to exist in more than just the spaces between possibilities." "But what about me?" Sarah asked. "What happens to who I am now?" "You become part of us," the figure explained. "Your memories, your experiences, your love for Mark, all of that joins with our collective knowledge of what could have been. You don't disappear, Sarah. You just stop being limited by the boundaries of this one particular existence." It sounded almost appealing when described that way. Sarah was so tired of fighting her own dissatisfaction, so exhausted by the constant struggle to appreciate a life that had never quite felt like it fit. The idea of simply dissolving into something larger, something that could encompass all possibilities, instead of being trapped in just one, offered a kind of release she'd never imagined. But then she heard a sound from somewhere in the house, a muffled thump, like someone trying to get attention while unable to speak. Mark. They hadn't taken him away from the house at all. They'd hidden him somewhere inside, probably tied up and gagged, waiting to see what she would decide. "Where is he?" Sarah demanded. The figure sighed. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "Where is my husband?" "In the basement," the figure admitted, unharmed. "Just restrained so he can't interfere. We hoped you would see reason without having to involve him directly, but if you insist on being difficult, though." The figure trailed off, but the implication was clear. If Sarah didn't cooperate willingly, they would use Mark to force her compliance. The thought of him suffering because of her choices, even choices between different versions of herself, was unbearable. "Let me see him," Sarah said. "Let me talk to him, make sure he's okay, then we can discuss what happens next." The figure studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was a genuine request or some kind of trap. Finally, it nodded. "Very well. But remember, Sarah, we know every thought in your head, every plan you might try to make. There's no escape from this situation except through acceptance." They walked downstairs together, the figure moving with Sarah's own gait, but somehow more graceful, more confident. The house looked normal in the dim light from the street lamps outside, showing no signs of the violent destruction Sarah had witnessed from the bedroom window. Either the damage had been repaired, or it had never been real in the first place. The basement door stood open, something that immediately struck Sarah as wrong. She and Mark always kept that door closed because the basement was unfinished and tended to be damp and musty. But now it gaped like a mouth, revealing darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. "After you," the figure said, gesturing toward the open doorway. Sarah hesitated at the top of the stairs. The basement had never been her favorite part of the house. It was cramped and poorly lit, full of storage boxes and old furniture they never used. But now it felt actively malevolent, as if something waited in the darkness below. "He's down there?" she asked. "Safe and sound?" the figure assured her, though probably not very comfortable. "We had to make sure he couldn't call for help or try to leave." Sarah started down the wooden steps, each one creaking under her weight. The figure followed close behind, close enough that she could feel its presence like a cold shadow. The basement light didn't work. It had burned out months ago, and they'd never bothered to replace it, so Sarah had to navigate by the dim light filtering down from upstairs. At the bottom of the steps, she paused to let her eyes adjust to the gloom. Gradually, she began to make out familiar shapes: the water heater in the corner, boxes of Christmas decorations stacked against one wall, Mark's old exercise equipment that he'd used for about 6 months before abandoning it. But where was Mark himself? "I don't see him," Sarah said, turning to look back at the figure. "Look more carefully," it suggested. Sarah moved deeper into the basement, squinting into the shadows. There in the far corner, behind a stack of boxes, she could just make out a human shape. She hurried toward it, her heart racing with relief and fear. Mark was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his hands apparently bound behind him and a gag covering his mouth. But his eyes were open and alert, tracking her movement as she approached. When he saw her, he made muffled sounds of what might have been relief or warning. "Mark!" Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, reaching for the gag. "Are you hurt? Did they Her hands passed right through him. Sarah stared in shock as her fingers encountered nothing but empty air where Mark's body should have been. She could see him clearly, could hear his muffled attempts to speak, but he had no physical substance. He was like a three-dimensional movie projection, completely realistic but ultimately intangible. "What did you do to him?" Sarah demanded, spinning to face the figure. "Nothing permanent," it said calmly. "He's been temporarily displaced, shifted slightly out of phase with this reality. It's the only way we could restrain him without causing physical harm." "Bring him back?" Sarah said. "Right now. I'm afraid that's not possible until the transition is complete," the figure replied. "Mark exists in the spaces between realities now, just as we did before we found our way here. The only way to restore him is to complete the process we started." Sarah realized she'd been maneuvered into this situation deliberately. The figure had known she would demand to see Mark, had known she would discover his strange condition, had probably counted on her protective instincts to force her into compliance. "If I agree to let you take over," Sarah said slowly, "you'll bring him back. We'll merge the realities," the figure corrected. "Mark will be restored to full existence and will take over the burden of living this life. Everyone wins." Sarah looked at Mark's translucent form, at the fear and confusion in his eyes. He was trying to tell her something, making urgent sounds behind the gag, but she couldn't understand what he was attempting to communicate. "Can he hear us?" she asked. "Every word," the figure confirmed. "He knows what's happening, knows what choice you have to make. And I think if he's honest with himself, he knows that his life will be better with us than it ever was with you." This was too much. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, hot and protective and stronger than any emotion she'd felt in months. These creatures could criticize her choices, could point out her failures and regrets, could even tempt her with promises of peace and release. But they had no right to suggest that Mark would be better off without her. "You don't know anything about our marriage," she said, her voice hardening. "You don't know what we mean to each other, don't we?" the figure asked. "We have all your memories, Sarah. We know about the fights you had last year about starting a family, how you kept putting it off because you weren't sure you wanted children with him. We know about the promotion you turned down because it would have required moving to another state, and how you resented him for asking you to consider his career too. We know about the other men you fantasized about, the ones you imagined yourself with when you and Mark were making love." Each revelation was like a slap, exposing private thoughts and shameful moments Sarah had never shared with anyone. But instead of making her feel guilty or defeated, the figure's words only made her angrier. "So what?" she said. "So I'm not perfect. So I have doubts and fantasies and regrets. That doesn't mean I don't love him. That doesn't mean our marriage isn't real and valuable and worth fighting for. Doesn't it?" the figure asked. "When was the last time you felt truly happy with him, Sarah? When was the last time you looked at him and felt nothing but love, without any shadow of disappointment or regret?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. The figure was right. She couldn't remember a time in recent years when her love for Mark hadn't been complicated by other feelings, when she'd been able to look at him without seeing a reminder of the choices that had led her away from other possibilities. But that didn't mean the love wasn't real. It just meant it was human, messy and complicated and imperfect like everything else in life. "Love isn't about never having doubts," Sarah said. "It's about choosing to stay and work through them. It's about commitment even when things are difficult. You want to take over my life because you think you can do it better, but you're missing the point. The struggles are part of what makes it meaningful." The figure's expression grew impatient. "That's a pretty sentiment, Sarah, but it doesn't change the facts. You're unhappy, Mark deserves better, and we can provide what both of you need. Why are you making this so difficult?" "Because it's my life," Sarah said simply. "My choices, my mistakes, my love. You can't just decide that I'm doing it wrong and take it away from me." "We're not taking anything away," the figure insisted. "We're offering you peace, release from the burden of a life that never fit properly. How is that not a gift?" Sarah looked at Mark again, at his translucent form and frightened eyes. He was still trying to communicate something, still making those urgent sounds behind his gag. What was he trying to tell her? Then she realized he wasn't trying to speak to her. He was trying to speak to the figure, to the creature that claimed to love him exactly as Sarah did, and his expression wasn't one of love or gratitude, it was terror and revulsion. "He's afraid of you," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. Even if you have my memories and feelings, even if you think you love him the same way I do, he can tell the difference. He knows you're not really me." The figure's confident expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something underneath that was cold and hungry and definitely not human. "That will pass," it said. "Once the transition is complete, once we've fully integrated into this reality, he won't be able to tell the difference. But there will always be a difference," Sarah realized. "Because you're not me. You're something else wearing my face, trying to live my life. And no matter how perfectly you copy my memories and mannerisms, you'll never really understand what it means to be human. We understand better than you do." The figure snapped, its composure finally cracking. "We've seen every possible version of your life, every choice you could have made. We know what you're capable of, what you could achieve if you weren't limited by fear and doubt and human weakness. But that's what makes us human," Sarah said. "The fear and doubt and weakness. You want to live my life perfectly, but perfection isn't what life is about. It's about struggling and failing and getting back up and trying again. It's about loving imperfectly and being loved despite your flaws." The figure was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could see other shapes moving in the basement's shadows. The rest of the creatures were there, listening to this conversation, waiting to see how it would end. "You're going to refuse," the figure said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah said. "I'm going to fight for my life, my marriage, my right to exist in this reality, even if I'm not living it perfectly." The figure nodded slowly, as if this wasn't entirely unexpected. "Then you've chosen the difficult path," it said. "We hoped you would be reasonable, that you would see the benefits of what we were offering. But we prepared for this possibility too." The shadows in the basement began to move, resolving into dozens of figures that looked exactly like Sarah. They surrounded her in Mark's translucent form, their eyes reflecting what little light filtered down from upstairs. "If you won't step aside willingly," the original figure said, "then we'll have to take what we need by force. It won't be as clean or peaceful as we hoped, but the end result will be the same." Sarah felt fear rising in her throat, but also something else, a fierce protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. These creatures could threaten her, could try to steal her life and her identity, but they would not hurt Mark. Not while she had any strength left to fight them. "How?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "How exactly do you plan to force me out of my own existence?" The figure smiled that wrong smile again. "The same way we got in," it said. "Through your own doubts and regrets. We'll show you every mistake you've ever made, every opportunity you've missed, every moment of happiness you've failed to achieve. We'll force you to confront the full weight of your own disappointment until you're begging us to take the burden away. And if that doesn't work, then we'll start with Mark," the figure said simply. "We'll show you what his life could have been like with someone better than you, someone who could have made him truly happy. We'll make you watch as he lives the life he deserved with a woman who appreciated him properly. Eventually, you'll realize that the kindest thing you can do is step aside and let us give him what you never could." Sarah felt tears starting to flow again, but this time they weren't tears of self-pity or regret. They were tears of rage, of absolute fury at these creatures who thought they could manipulate her into abandoning everything she cared about. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "About everything. About me, about Mark, about what love means and what life is supposed to be like." "Am I?" the figure asked. "Then prove it. Show us this great love you claim to have for him. Demonstrate this strength you think you possess. Fight for the life you say is worth keeping." The challenge hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not just tonight, but weeks of escalating incidents, weeks of doubt and fear and growing isolation. The creatures had been preparing her for this confrontation, weakening her defenses and making her question her own reality. But they had made one crucial mistake. They thought her doubts and regrets made her weak, thought her imperfect love made her unworthy of the life she'd built. They didn't understand that those same flaws could also be sources of strength, that human love was powerful precisely because it persisted despite imperfection. "All right," Sarah said, wiping her eyes and straightening her shoulders. "Let's do this." The figures began to close in around her, their movements fluid and predatory. Sarah stood her ground, one hand reaching out toward Mark's translucent form even though she couldn't touch him. Whatever happened next, She would face it as herself flawed, imperfect, human Sarah who had made mistakes and harbored regrets, but who loved her husband enough to fight impossible odds for the chance to keep loving him. The battle for her reality was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez, school nurse, imperfect wife, ordinary woman with extraordinary determination, was ready to face whatever came next. Because they might not knock anymore, but they hadn't won yet, and as long as Sarah had breath in her body and love in her heart, they never would. Sarah stood on the porch, all looking up at the bedroom window, all smiling that wrong smile she'd seen on her doppelganger's face. The Sarah controlling her body raised her hand and waved at the figures below. They waved back in perfect unison, their movements synchronized, as if they were all connected to the same controlling intelligence. Then they turned toward the front door and began to scratch. The sound was deafening, dozens of sets of claws tearing at wood, metal scraping against metal as they worked to destroy not just the door, but the entire front of the house. Sarah could hear the structure groaning under the assault, could see pieces of siding and trim falling away as the figures systematically dismantled the barrier between inside and outside. But when she tried to look toward Mark, to see if the noise was waking him, the thing controlling her body wouldn't let her turn her head. She was forced to watch the destruction below, to witness her own face multiplied dozens of times as the figures prepared to enter her home. The front door gave way first, collapsing inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. The figures poured through the opening, moving with that same underwater fluidity, their footsteps strangely muffled despite their rapid movement. Sarah could hear them spreading through the house below, opening doors and drawers, searching for something or someone. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made Sarah's heart race, but she still couldn't control her own reactions. The thing wearing her body remained calm and still, continuing to watch through the window as if nothing unusual was happening. But Sarah could feel its satisfaction, its sense of completion as the plan it had been working toward for weeks finally came to fruition. "Sarah." Mark's voice called from the bed behind her. He was waking up, finally responding to the noise of the house being invaded. "What's going on? What's that sound?" The Sarah at the window turned slowly, and for the first time in hours, Sarah felt herself regain control of her own body. The paralysis lifted abruptly, leaving her dizzy and disoriented as her consciousness snapped back into full control. She spun around to face Mark, opening her mouth to warn him, to tell him to run or hide or call for help. But before she could speak, the bedroom door burst open. Dozens of